The bright flashes of cameras filled the air like 1,000 tiny stars colliding, casting long shadows over the polished floors of the press conference room. A buzz of whispered conversations hummed through the crowd of reporters, all eager for a glimpse of the day's big headline. Everyone knew it was coming. Today's press briefing would be unlike any other. But what no one anticipated was the moment that would shift the entire narrative. At the front of the room, standing poised yet unassuming, was Barron Trump, the young son of former First Lady Melania Trump and former President Donald Trump. To many, he was still a figure of mystery, a quiet presence who seemed far removed from the spotlight that often consumed his family. Today, though, Barron would become the center of attention, not just because of his last name, but because of a moment that would define the relationship between a mother and her son, and reshape the public's perception of both. A lone reporter, eager for a story that might tarnish the Trump legacy, raised his hand with a question that was more an accusation than a query. He leaned forward, almost savoring the chance to make a headline that would bring Melania Trump to the forefront once again, hoping for a scandal, a slip-up. "Barron," the reporter began with a mock-serious tone, "you've been so sheltered from the media all these years, but now you're stepping into the public eye. Your mother's reign as First Lady was often surrounded by controversy. Do you feel it's your responsibility to fix the image of the Trump family, especially when it comes to how the public views your mother?" A hush fell over the room. Eyes locked onto Barron, who sat at the table, unmoving. The reporter's question hung in the air like an accusation, daring Barron to react. Would he crumble under the weight of public scrutiny? Would he let this man belittle his mother in front of the world? For a moment, it seemed as though Barron might not answer at all. But then something shifted. With a quiet intensity, the teenager looked up, meeting the reporter's eyes. In that single glance, there was an unspoken message that cut through the tension. Barron wasn't just here as a passive participant, he was here to protect. And that was when the true drama began. The press conference, once a routine event, would become a pivotal moment in Barron Trump's life. It was his first step into a much larger world, one where his voice and his defiance could command the stage. The reporter's question still lingered in the room, hanging heavily in the silence that followed. The cameras clicked relentlessly, eager to capture every moment of Barron's response. But in that instant, time seemed to slow down. The air was thick with expectation, with the weight of every eye on Barron, as if the fate of the Trump family rested entirely on his next move. He could feel the pressure building, the years of being shielded from the spotlight now seemingly irrelevant. This moment was his, and it was a test of everything he had quietly observed over the years. Barron's gaze shifted from the reporter to his mother, seated a few feet away, her poised demeanor betraying no sign of the storm that churned just beneath the surface. Melania's presence was always serene, yet in that moment Barron saw something deeper, an unspoken vulnerability, a mother who had weathered countless storms in the public eye and who had always shielded him from it. For a fleeting second, Barron wished he could take that weight off her shoulders. But he knew it was no longer just her fight. It was his now, too. "Are you really asking me that?" Barron's voice was calm, measured, yet there was a note of steel beneath it, a quiet defiance that no one could have anticipated. The room froze. His words were not only an answer, they were a challenge. Barron stood up, adjusting his suit jacket with the ease of someone who had rehearsed 1,000 times in his mind exactly how he would face moments like this. The reporter, taken aback, stammered slightly before trying to salvage his question. "I just mean—" Barron cut him off with a sharp wave of his hand. "I don't need to defend my mother. She's never needed defending." His voice rang out with conviction, each word heavy with the kind of certainty that could not be easily ignored. "What my mother has done for this country, for millions of people, speaks louder than anything you could ever say." It was a powerful moment, one that not only silenced the reporter, but also shifted the entire energy in the room. For a brief moment, Barron was no longer the quiet, reserved son of a famous family. He was his own person, someone who would no longer remain in the shadows, someone who would stand up for the people he loved. Melania, though caught off guard by her son's sudden courage, couldn't help but feel a swell of pride rise within her. The relationship between mother and son had always been close, built on mutual respect and a shared understanding of the scrutiny they faced. But this was different. Barron wasn't just reacting. He was taking charge of his own narrative, reshaping it in real time. The reporters were quick to jot down notes, murmuring among themselves. Some were impressed, others uncertain of what they had just witnessed. But the ripples of Barron's words would extend far beyond the press conference room. This was the moment when everything changed, for him and for the public's perception of the Trump family. And as the cameras continued to flash, Barron realized that he had just ignited a firestorm, one that would follow him long after the briefing ended. The days following Barron's sharp retort at the press conference were a whirlwind. Media outlets ran the footage on loop, dissecting every word, every gesture. Some called him brave, others naive. His name was suddenly everywhere, on the front pages, in social media trends, the subject of endless debate. For Barron, the world he had long avoided had thrust itself into his life, demanding his attention whether he wanted it or not. At first, Barron felt a rush of adrenaline, a sense of purpose in the aftermath of his defiant moment. He'd silenced the reporter, and in doing so, he'd given voice to something far deeper, a loyalty to his mother, a sense of pride in the family legacy that was often misunderstood or ridiculed. He was proud of his response, but as the days wore on, the weight of the media's scrutiny began to settle over him. His mother's calm demeanor in public remained unshaken, but Barron could see the toll it was taking behind the scenes. The phone calls, the meetings, the never-ending stream of people who wanted something from them. It was all becoming overwhelming. One evening, Barron sat in his room, the hum of the television in the background, but his focus was elsewhere. The noise of the world outside seemed to pulse louder the more he tried to tune it out. He looked at his phone, which had become a constant barrage of messages, some supportive, some hostile. He couldn't avoid it anymore. His words had sparked something bigger than he'd anticipated, and now there were voices from all corners of the world trying to shape his narrative. His phone buzzed again, a message from a reporter who had once been sympathetic, now casting doubts on Barron's political motives. Was Barron really the person people thought he was? Or was he just another pawn in a game of power? The questions gnawed at him. Had I been used? Was my anger at the reporter a reaction to the pressure, or was it something more? The self-doubt crept in like a dark cloud. Barron sank deeper into his thoughts, wrestling with the idea that perhaps he wasn't as ready for the spotlight as he had convinced himself. It felt like the ground beneath him was shifting, and he wasn't sure how to stay grounded. Melania sensed his discomfort and came to his room that night. She didn't need to say anything at first. Her presence was enough. Sitting beside him, she simply placed her hand on his, offering quiet reassurance. "You were brave, Barron, but bravery doesn't mean you always have to fight. Sometimes it means knowing when to step back, when to stand tall for what matters." Her words were a comfort, but Barron still couldn't shake the feeling of being caught in something much larger than himself. The pressure to uphold a family legacy, to always be strong, to always have the right answer. It was more than anyone his age should bear. And yet Barron couldn't help but feel the pull of his own convictions. The world was watching now, and whatever happened next would shape the future. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The tension in Barron's chest had only grown stronger as the days passed. Every step outside felt like a performance. Paparazzi lurked at the edges of his life, capturing every glance, every move, every word he spoke. Even a trip to the grocery store felt like an invasion. But Barron had endured, holding steady despite the rising storm. He had his mother's quiet strength to guide him, but the weight of public scrutiny was still a heavy burden to carry. Then, one afternoon, something unexpected happened. Something that shattered the illusion of control Barron had carefully constructed. Barron was at home, working through his homework, when a phone call disrupted his quiet afternoon. It was an unfamiliar number, but given the recent chaos, he couldn't afford to ignore it. He picked up, his thumb hovering over the screen as he steeled himself for whatever news awaited him. "Barron, it's Thomas," a voice crackled on the other end. Barron's brow furrowed. Thomas was an old family friend, someone who'd worked with his father for years, but what he said next sent a shock through Barron's entire body. "They're coming after her." Thomas's voice was thick with urgency. "The press is going to make a full-on attack. They've got sources claiming she was involved in something that could bring the entire family down." Barron's blood ran cold. The phone felt heavy in his hand, as though the very weight of the moment was too much to hold. His mother had always been careful, always calculated. She was private, yes, but never reckless. The thought of her being dragged into something dangerous, something fabricated, filled him with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "You can't let them get away with this," Thomas continued, his voice strained. "You have to protect her. You have to speak out, before it's too late." Barron didn't know what to say. The words felt too large for him to comprehend, too loaded to be real. Could this really be happening? Could there be something, anything, behind the smear campaign they were about to launch against his mother? He hung up the phone, the silence that followed suffocating in its intensity. Barron's mind raced. The world had already been quick to tear apart the legacy his family had built. But this felt different. This wasn't just about his name or his image. This was about his mother's integrity, her reputation, everything she had worked for. And more than anything, it was about protecting her from a system that had shown time and time again that it thrived on destruction. Barron paced back and forth, the anxiety threatening to overwhelm him. He had always watched from the sidelines, an observer to the chaos. But now, he realized that his time as a passive figure had come to an end. He couldn't stand by any longer. The time had come to fight back, not just for his family's name, but for the truth. He picked up his phone again, this time with a new sense of purpose. He had to find a way to get ahead of this, before the story spiraled out of control. The press had no idea what they were about to awaken. The game had just changed, and Barron Trump was no longer the boy behind the scenes. He was stepping into the ring. The phone call with Thomas had done something else as well. It had awakened something inside Barron, a realization that he wasn't just his mother's son. He wasn't just the quiet kid watching his family from afar. He was his own person, and now it was time for him to stand up, speak out, and face whatever came next, head on. This wasn't just about protecting his mother anymore. This was about carving out his own identity in a world that had always seen him as little more than a footnote. And Barron was done being anyone's footnote. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, strategy meetings, and rapidly escalating tension. Barron's world had shifted irrevocably. What had started as a moment of defiance in the press conference now seemed like a prelude to an all-out media war. He had spent sleepless nights planning, talking to advisors, trying to get a handle on the fast-moving storm that threatened to engulf his family. But as much as he tried to prepare, nothing could have truly prepared him for the moment that was coming. The media firestorm hit harder and faster than anyone had anticipated. A leaked report hit the internet, unverified but explosive. The story claimed that Melania Trump had been secretly involved in a high-profile scandal that could unravel her time as First Lady. The article was full of innuendo, unnamed sources, and broad accusations. The pieces didn't add up, but the damage was done. By the time Barron saw the headlines, they were everywhere, on TV, in newspapers, flooding social media feeds. He sat in front of his laptop, scrolling through the barrage of messages. The online vitriol was enough to make anyone recoil. Mockery, accusations, calls for his mother's resignation from public life. His stomach churned as he saw the words people were throwing at her, at them. The calm resolve that had sustained him for so long was starting to crack. But then, a shift. Barron slammed the laptop closed. His mother wasn't the only one they'd been attacking. They were attacking him now, too. The insults, the attempts to paint him as complicit, as just another cog in a family machine. He couldn't stand it anymore. They had underestimated him. They had underestimated her. Barron stood up, heart pounding with an adrenaline he hadn't felt before. This wasn't just about defending a reputation. It was about standing up for what was right, about reclaiming the narrative. It was about proving that he wasn't afraid to fight for the truth, no matter the cost. He knew exactly what he had to do. He called a press conference, a move that shocked everyone. Advisors scrambled, suggesting alternatives, hoping he'd reconsider. But Barron was resolute. He wasn't going to let the world dictate his family's story anymore. The time for passive silence had passed. He would speak, and he would speak the truth. The morning of the press conference, Barron stood before the cameras, feeling the weight of every pair of eyes trained on him. Melania was by his side, ever the picture of grace, but Barron could see the strain in her eyes, a reflection of the battle she had been fighting quietly for years. She had tried to shield him from the ugliness, but now there was no turning back. They were in this together. The reporters surged forward, clamoring for a statement, but Barron raised his hand, silencing them. His voice was calm, but fierce. "You've been asking the wrong questions," Barron began, his words ringing out with clarity. "You've been focusing on lies, on stories that are meant to tear people down, but you haven't asked about the truth." The room fell silent. Barron's words carried the weight of everything he had learned in the past few weeks, the power of perception, the ruthlessness of the press, and most importantly, the strength that had always resided within him. He continued, his tone unwavering. "My mother is not the woman you've tried to paint. She's not perfect, but she has always acted with dignity. She has always put others before herself. And I am here today to tell you, the truth will always rise above your lies." It was. A moment of raw, unfiltered emotion, a son standing up for his mother, for everything she had sacrificed. A quiet teenager, thrust into a battle he had never chosen, now wielding his voice as a weapon against a system that had always tried to tear his family apart. The reporters were silent. Barron's statement wasn't just an answer, it was a declaration. For the first time, Barron wasn't just responding to the press. He was rewriting the rules of the game. The media storm would continue, of course. There would still be battles to fight, stories to correct, and the truth to keep defending. But in that moment, Barron knew something had changed. He had crossed a threshold from being an observer of his family's drama to being an active participant in shaping its future. And as the cameras flashed, Barron Trump understood that this was only the beginning. The days following Barron's press conference were a whirlwind of shifting media narratives. The initial backlash was expected. Skepticism from some, praise from others. But something had changed in the tone of the coverage. The storm that had threatened to tear apart his family's image began to lose its strength. The relentless assault on Melania Trump, and by extension on Barron, had finally met with an unanticipated resistance. Barron's powerful defense of his mother had not only stood in the face of criticism, but it had exposed the cracks in the media's relentless pursuit of scandal. People began to ask questions, not just about the accusations, but about the truth behind them. Melania, ever composed, remained a beacon of quiet strength, though Barron could tell the battle had taken its toll on her. There were moments when she let her guard down, brief glances shared between them when the cameras weren't rolling, where the weight of the past few weeks hung between them. But even then, Barron could sense her pride in him. She had always been protective of him. But now he had taken on the mantle of protector, not just of her, but of their family's story. And in that, something had shifted. They were no longer simply figures in the public eye. They were people bound together by something deeper than the media ever understood. The press, too, began to back off. The fabricated rumors about Melania's involvement in scandals fizzled out as quickly as they had arrived, unable to hold against Barron's unapologetic defense. The public's thirst for sensationalism didn't go unquenched, but the core of the narrative had changed. Barron was no longer the quiet, almost invisible figure beside his mother. He had found his voice, and with it, he had found his place in the world. His decision to speak out had not just reshaped the way people saw his mother. It had reshaped the way they saw him. For Barron, the path ahead was no less uncertain than before. The weight of his family's history, of their public lives, would never fully disappear. But the media's gaze had shifted, if only slightly, and Barron realized that, for the first time, he had more control over the narrative. He had learned something invaluable over the past few weeks. It wasn't enough to simply remain in the background, to wait for things to unfold around him. Sometimes, the only way forward was to confront the storm head-on, to shape the story instead of letting it shape you. In the weeks that followed, Barron's relationship with his mother grew even stronger. They spoke more openly about the pressures. They faced about the burdens of public life and the weight of expectation. Melania shared her experiences with him, stories of resilience, of standing firm in the face of judgment and false narratives. Barron had always known his mother was a figure of strength, but now he truly understood the depth of that strength, the quiet power that had carried her through the most tumultuous years of their lives. One evening, as they sat together after another long day, Melania turned to Barron. "You did well, my son," she said softly, her voice carrying a warmth that only a mother's could. "You are more than I ever could have imagined you to be." Barron looked at her, the weight of her words sinking in. He had spent so much of his life standing beside her, watching her navigate the complexities of public life, unsure of where he fit into it all. But now, he knew. He wasn't just a spectator. He was an active participant in the story of their lives, a story that was still unfolding, full of its own challenges, its own triumphs. He smiled, a sense of peace settling over him. "I'm just getting started, Mom." And as the days went on, Barron realized that the journey wasn't about the fame, the headlines, or the pressure of living under a public microscope. It was about the people who mattered most: family, truth, and the quiet strength that came from standing up for what was right. In that moment, Barron Trump understood something fundamental. You don't need to shout to be heard. Sometimes it's the quietest voice, the one that speaks with purpose, that can change everything. The storm had passed, but the lessons it had taught him would stay with him forever. Barron wasn't just his mother's son anymore. He was his own man. And as he walked forward into the future, one thing was certain. He would face whatever came next, not as the person the world expected him to be, but as the person he had chosen to become. The cameras might still flash. The media might still follow. But Barron had learned, at last, how to walk with his head held high. And that was all that mattered.